Why is inflation so high? Should teachers be paid more? And is Birmingham about to go bust? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Laura Farris, Labour's Shadow International Development Secretary Preet Gill, former Labour advisor Jade Azim and Unheard's political editor Tom McTague. Today, 6 months ago, Rishi Sunak made this promise.
We will halve inflation this year to ease the cost of living and give people financial security.
So why is it proving so hard to bring down inflation? More classroom disruption as teachers in England strike again. Do they deserve more pay? And should the government bail out Birmingham to protect the council from financial ruin?
This council cannot be trusted with the finances and the future, let alone the present of this great city of ours.
Let's start with this headline in The Times. An interview with the former Health Secretary. Ailing NHS has made us sicker, says Sajid Javid, ex-Health Secretary, calls for Royal Commission. Well, there's nothing like a former Cabinet Minister for speaking their mind. My opening question to you, all starting with you, Laura, because he goes into the interview and says, of course, as we approach that next general election, political parties will energetically debate the future of the NHS. But behind closed doors, they know the current setup is unsustainable. Saying that publicly is much more difficult. Are politicians not being straight with us about the future of the NHS?
I think politicians are actually moving to a position where they are being honest about the NHS. And, you know, it's something that I think as a country we take enormous pride in, but it shouldn't be impossible to say that, yes, it needs to be properly resourced, and its spend for the budget that's been allocated it for next year is 165 billion, which is an astronomical amount of money, but also that it needs to be properly reformed. And an organisation that was first constructed in a totally different context 75 years ago, we shouldn't be shy about saying that there may be ways to make it more efficient, to improve management structures, to see how tech and AI can be brought in to make it run more smoothly, to look at whether productivity is at the maximum at every level, not just with nurses and doctors, but actually with the managerial layers that sit at the top. All of those things do deserve proper scrutiny from MPs, whatever their stripe. And actually, one of the things that Sajid is saying, a Royal Commission is of necessity a cross-party, politically neutral endeavour. And I think there is, room to talk about something like that.
Well, I mean, Laura has hinted that perhaps politicians haven't always been honest with the public about the state or future of the NHS. Sajid Javid is calling for a total rethink, not just reform. We've had reform, endless reform, a total rethink. But do you think politicians haven't been honest with us?
I think, look, firstly, what's unsustainable is another 5 years of the Tory government, because they're the architects of this crisis. We do need more investment and reform. We have to ask ourselves how we got into this position. The NHS only spends 5% of its budget on prevention. We need to look at how care is delivered, where care is delivered. The fact of the matter is we have more people coming into A&E, which is putting lots of pressure on hospitals because they can't get a GP surgery. That means they're waiting at home. Their illness is getting much worse. And so we're having to treat people, which is very expensive.
So are you talking about more money going in on top of the record levels of investment?
It isn't just about more money, though. It's about how we are spending that money, where that money is being used. So it's about making sure people can access early services in their own communities. They can get diagnosis much earlier. They're not having to turn up to hospital with conditions that are very, very costly. We have now got new technology, AI. We've got to look at diagnostics, different ways of working, and this is about investment. For Labour, though, the NHS will always be public funded, free at the point of use, and that is really important. It isn't about the funding models, because that is distracting away from the issues. The issue is about investment and reform, more reform.
Can you make the same commitment?
Well, I just wanted to come back on part of what Preet was saying. I don't accept that it's sort of 5 years of Conservative failure. Yes, of course, there are enormous sort of lag pressures from the pandemic, but the reality is we have an ageing society. If you were born in 2012, you've got a 50% chance of living to be 103. That you can't have preventative measures for people getting very, very old.
You don't have a plan for social care.
And when I talk to, for example, GPs in my constituency, they say that the two things that dominate their practices on a day-to-day basis are age-related conditions that come from an older society and obesity and the comorbidities that come with that. And we have perhaps got to be more honest about the reality of what the NHS is dealing with.
But you're talking about public health investment.
Well, when we talk about public health investment, Sajid Javid refers to record levels of investment in cash terms and in real terms. But the level of increase has definitely slowed and even come right down since 2010. Do you think politicians haven't been straight with the public about the sorts of issues that we've just heard from Laura and Preet?
I imagine that, well, first of all, from a political perspective, Rishi Sunak's probably banging his head a little bit at this intervention. Look, at the very moment...
Sajid Javid, I'm sure.
At the very moment, we're facing an acute crisis where people, are not accessing waiting lists. This is an acute problem that a lot of patients are worrying about. And a royal commission, sure, maybe in the next 2, 3, 5 years, might go some way to a sort of addressing those sort of longer-term issues. But looking forward to the next 18 months of a general election, I'm not sure this is particularly politically helpful.
Right. Or is it politically helpful to ask for a more honest debate? Is the funding formula the problem? Does that need to be looked at? Sajid Javid talks about looking at comparable European or other developed countries where they do have a different funding formula.
Yeah, I mean, a royal commission sounds like a terrible idea to me.
Because it takes forever.
It takes forever, and we kind of know what the answers are. Yes, we need some more funding. I think you can sort of slice and dice it any which way, can't you? I think there was a piece this morning talking about how the NHS has got record funding. It isn't underfunded, but then you compare it in. You look at statistics in another way, and you look at how much we're spending per person in the UK, and we're sort of really in the middle of comparable countries. So more funding is necessary. But old age care is clearly the big problem, and that's not covered by the NHS. And we haven't reformed it, and neither party has reformed it. Labour didn't reform it, and the Tories didn't reform it.
But we have had endless reform in terms of having private sector outsourcing, in terms of the Lansley reforms, which was that top-down transformation. That was then reversed. We've had all sorts of reform. Is it more than reform that's needed?
Well, we haven't had a workforce strategy. I mean, that's one of the big key issues. I mean, the fact of the matter is you've got 150,000 vacancies. The government slashed doctors being retrained. We're relying on red list countries to provide and prop up our NHS, and that's not sustainable either. I mean, had we, in the last 13 years, had a proper workforce strategy, had more training opportunities, had more pathways into social care, into nursing, NVQ level training, in hospitals, then actually we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. This is 13 years of a Tory mismanagement, not understanding actually how to run the NHS, and that's why we're in this position.
Laura?
Well, we've got the highest number of doctors and nurses ever in the NHS, and last week the Prime Minister announced his workforce plan. But I think that you're making a good point, Jo, which is I think what you're saying is, has there been tinkering around the edges, and is something more fundamental required? And I do think that these are the big issues which any serious government, irrespective of political stripe, needs to grapple with. And I think one of the things that's coming very rapidly, which does have the power to transform health services, is tech and the use of AI. And I represent some of the big sort of health AI businesses in my constituency, and the way that they project sort of non-urgent care could be delivered is transformative. So I think healthcare is going to change of necessity, but I think any government needs to be asking really bold questions about this.
All right, well, let's talk about the pledges that Rishi Sunak made at the beginning of the year. You heard one of them. We're going to talk about it. It was to halve inflation, the rate of inflation, by the end of this year, from 10.7%. That was the figure for the fourth quarter of 2022. it's proving to be extremely difficult. It's been described as being stuck, as it has remained at 8.7% from April to May. Let's just show you here the Consumer Prices Index annual rate. You can see where Rishi Sunak's target is, certainly by the end of this year, just before January 24, and it should be just over 4.5%. Laura, are you losing confidence that Rishi Sunak's pledge will be met?
No, I'm not losing confidence.
You're as confident today as you were when he made that pledge at the beginning of the year.
When I came on the show at the start of the year, the criticism I had from some of the guests was he set himself 5 easy pledges that he's easily going to meet. He's obviously going to halve inflation, and he's chosen something that's so, basic and obvious. And that was.
But isn't that why he thought he did think that, didn't he?
No, that was never the case. He set himself 5 targets to halve inflation, grow the economy, reduce debt, cut waiting lists, and stop the boats. And he's invited the British public to judge him by those 5 pledges. Unlike, with great respect, Keir Starmer, who has offered absolutely nothing and is just hoping that the Conservatives will fail and he can come in on their kind of coattails. But can I just say this? Yes, inflation's very sticky. Tom's article, which I read and I thought was really sensibly written about the blunt instruments and the lack of a comprehensive set of tools that any government has when there is an entrenched inflationary position. But the Bank of England is still predicting that inflation is going to fall. And if I could just say one thing, Jo. I read an article yesterday that said that mortgage holders who are remortgaging now are overwhelmingly going for variable rate mortgages rather than fixed. That, I would suggest, is a sign of confidence from the British people into the Prime Minister, because they still believe he's going to bring inflation down. If they didn't, they would be fixing.
Or maybe because today, just before we came on air, BBC News reported that mortgage rates, average 5-year fix, has gone above 6%.
But if they thought inflation was going to continue rising, it would be sensible to fix, because it could get worse.
Or it's a difficult place between...
they're just panicking. They don't want to lock in at 6% for 5 years when they've been paying 1.3 or 1.6 or whatever. That's like a £500 a month increase, or £1,000 a month.
Yeah,
some of my friends are talking about £1,000 a month. That's massive. But this is one of the problems. Is Rishi Sunak is promising to halve inflation, but he doesn't have the tools at his disposal to do so. He's outsourced that, or he hasn't outsourced it. It's been outsourced for 20 years to the Bank of England. So he's making a promise that he is asking somebody else to deliver. So he's not in control.
Right. He's not in control, as you have set out in your piece. Why is it so difficult, though, to bring down inflation? That's one reason, because you're saying it's left to the Bank of England. But Rishi Sunak himself has said he does have some tools at his disposal. There are things he could do. Why is it proving so hard?
Well, because it's very difficult. There are no easy answers. If you go back to the 1970s, which is the sort of the closest comparison to where we are, what you do is you have to squeeze the economy down to try and get rid of inflation. And what does that mean? You're making people poorer than they otherwise would be. You're having to hold down their wages. You're having to increase the cost of their mortgages.
So why was it possible over the last 10, 15 years? We had very low interest rates and inflation was low too.
Well, there are huge global issues. We had cheap goods being pumped out from China. We had freedom of movement from the European Union. And we didn't have very strong unions. So you've got 3 issues which are coming together and changing. We're cutting off trade from China, and freedom of movement has ended. So all of these things are adding together.
Right. Do you think he is going to meet that pledge?
I'm not really sure. I'm not sure it matters, actually, as much in terms of the election, because if he does so, people are still going to be feeling much, much poorer than they were. Right.
You don't think it matters either, Jade, if he meets that pledge?
I think that there's going to be huge political pain on his end, regardless. As Tom's alluded to, there's always 20-25% of the population that's going to be massively squeezed. Previously, it was other age groups. Right now, it feels like young and middle-income lenders and renters are those of essentially the big red button that's been pushed at any crisis in the last 20 years. And that didn't matter politically in the last, 3 election cycles, but it's starting to matter now, because increasingly, mortgage homeowners are around 50% of the Tory base. And now they're being squeezed. It's going to be hugely politically painful.
A lot of them don't actually have a mortgage.
No. Well, so a lot of them have paid off their mortgages. You're talking about the older ones.
We do need a secure economy. People do need security in terms of their family finances, and we can't just get away from what Liz Truss did to our economy. I mean, this is the failure of 13 years in terms of family households. Inflation being so high means that actually we're spending more than...
Inflation hasn't been high over the last 13 years.
hasn't. No, it's gone up because they've crashed the economy. But if you look at the family shop, it's gone up by £1,000 a year. And you can't just blame the global issues. Yes, we accept Ukraine obviously had an impact. And the rising cost of the energy prices have had an impact. But of course, it is about the decision that this government took. I mean, it sold off our gas storage. It hasn't invested in renewables. We're not seeing growth. You've got to be able to support people around cost of living.
Tell me, what would you do? I know you talk about the record. Quite rightly, you're the opposition. You talk about the Conservatives' record since 2010. But now, if you're looking at the election next year and Labour wins that election, what would you do? Tom says there aren't many levers, if any, really big levers for a government to pull, because it's the Bank of England's job. What would you do differently?
Well, I think Rachel's really set that out very clearly.
Rachel
Reeves, yes. We've said that we would support cost of living. We know that food prices are up, so obviously producing food is really expensive. How we support industry, how we address supply chains is going to be really important.
How would that bring down inflation?
I'll come back to that. Fiscal responsibility, making sure, obviously, debt is not ballooning, and then having a clear plan for growth and certainty, having an industrial strategy. This government doesn't have that. I mean, how on earth, if people's mortgages have gone up, they haven't got enough disposable income to go out and spend? You're not going to grow the economy. And let's not forget, a third of people are going to be affected by their mortgage rates going up. So,
But let's focus on how governments actually tackle this issue of high inflation. I mean, Laura, if Tom is right and there aren't many levers to pull, should the Bank of England's remit be looked at again? And are we looking at inflation always being higher than 2%, which is the target?
No, well, I think the economy took a number of unprecedented shocks through the pandemic, through the restriction of gas supplies to Europe, which was occasioned by Russia's decision following its invasion of Ukraine, and because of the supply chain issues that follow the pandemic. It is interesting listening to Preet because she doesn't have any solutions for bringing down inflation. And
growing the economy would help, wouldn't it?
Yes. It might increase inflation if you did that.
It might do, yeah.
I mean,
but we've seen the interest rates go up by 12 times by the Bank of England. I mean, you know, it is slower in terms of people being able to go out and spend more. I mean, we haven't seen that shift in terms of those tightening of budgets as yet.
You know, interest rates have risen rapidly, and there's, you know, there are going to be different views on whether that was, you know, too late or too. But I'm not going to get into that. But obviously, the effect of interest rates rising rapidly is to incentivise saving, which, you know, because of the effect on mortgages, is to reduce disposable income. But ultimately, what we want less money chasing fewer goods if we're going to bring inflation down.
Right, but if growing the economy, as you said, might actually fuel inflation, that's another one of Rishi Sunak's targets, and that is to grow the economy.
Well, this is what we had with the Liz Truss situation, where on the one hand she was putting the foot on the accelerator, and on the other hand the bank was panicking and putting their foot on the brake. So, you know, at least in the 1970s, you got to a point at the end where there were looking at it in the round towards the end with James Callaghan and then Margaret Thatcher. But what ended up crashing, bringing down inflation? A giant recession in the early 1990s. That's the thing that brought down inflation. And then it was back at 10% by the end of by 1990. So it feels like we're back in this situation, this endemic problem in the British economy.
Right. Should Rishi Sunak avoid the temptation of an inflationary tax cut close to the election?
Well, I'm not going to, you know, make any projections, but I do think one of the things, just following on from what Tom said, is that monetary and fiscal policy
that's what he'd like to do.
Direction, yeah. and I think that is exactly what the government's trying to do. That sort of fiscal responsibility that you're seeing going hand in hand.
Right. I mean, but the question is, should he avoid the temptation? I mean, whether he does or not, but should he avoid the temptation of an inflationary tax cut?
Well, he'll have to look at where we are closer to the election, and that's going to depend on what happens with inflation. Of course, if inflation's high, there'll have to be a degree of, you know, caution. But you know. It's difficult to judge, Jo, which I think is, you know, your point is there was no movement between April and May, but that is not a clear determinant that there will be no fall in inflation over the next 6 months.
No, but it might just happen automatically, which to some extent is what Rishi Sunak was relying on at the beginning of the year, that it would happen naturally. I mean, if it doesn't, and you said that the public will judge him on those pledges,
and
do you agree?
Him to do
right,
so.
And so politically, how damaging is it going to be at that election if he has not met halving inflation, growth rising above the sort of anaemic rates it is at the moment, and bringing down debt? Because the three of them, to some extent, are linked.
Well, I agree. His first three priorities are all economic. And just on growth may be, you know, projected to be quite low, but a recession was predicted as recently as 6 months ago, and that's changed. And I think one of the things that I notice when I'm out on the doorstep is that people do think of Rishi as exceptionally economically competent. And I'm amazed at how often they still recall the furlough scheme. And so he set himself those targets, and he's, prepared to be judged by them. If they haven't been met, yes, he'll be judged for that.
Right.
He's judged as being out of touch. He doesn't understand, actually. People in my constituency are really feeling the pinch. I mean, the weekly shop has gone up massively. That's about £1,000 a year. And if you've gone from 2% to, say, 6%, that's nearly £500–600 per month on your mortgage that has gone up. Work is not paying for lots of people. And, of course, a third of people are going to be renewing next year. They're going to really feel the pain, and what they're wanting from this government is for them to really understand what it means for families and to provide some support. But of course he's leaving it to lenders. There's no mandatory measures in place to support people at this time.
You know that the Chancellor's worked really closely with the banks on, for example, preventing repossessions, allowing people to switch to interest-only
mortgages.
mortgages.
We're saying that the bank should give a 6-month period before actually looking at repossessions. We're saying that banks need to...
That has happened, and that was announced last week. And also the fact that you can move to an interest-only repayment.
I'm pleased that you're taking our proposals forward, because that is absolutely good, because you were sort of saying, leave it to the banks, let's have voluntary measures. You do need mandatory measures. That's exactly what the public is looking for. They're looking for a Prime Minister that understands what they are going through and is prepared to go and ask lenders to do the right thing and provide them with the support that they actually need right now.
All right, let's move on and talk about teachers and strikes. This headline in The Independent: Union chiefs call on Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, to publish pay review body's recommendations. Now, the pay review body is reported to be recommending a pay rise next year of 6.5%. The government had offered a £1,000 one-off payment and 4.5% for staff next year. We've got the strikes scheduled for tomorrow and for Friday. Should Gillian Keegan, they're calling on her to do so, publish what the pay review body has recommended, and they're working behind it?
I don't think that that's customary for the government to do. I have been working with teachers in my constituency, and I know that there is an impasse at the moment. I think that every time I come on the show, we talk about one sector and pay, and these discussions have been really difficult. But I do think when you're balancing everything together, first observation is that the two sides are not a million miles apart.
So should she just pay it? 6.5%. I have had politician after politician on the government side sit where you're sitting, Laura, possibly you too, saying we follow the pay review recommendations. But that's what we do. We don't overrule them. We follow them. Why isn't she just coming out and saying, you get 6.5%?
Because she's looking at everything in the round, and there has to be fairness, not just to public sector workers, but also to private sector workers. Teachers, for example, are on defined benefit pensions. That's an unusual and extremely expensive and generous pension arrangement. Nobody is suggesting taking that away from them. But you can't pretend that that's not a high part of their total remuneration that has to be factored in any pay consideration. And by the way, Jo, you will have noticed that when Bridget Phillipson was asked the same question about whether or not she would, the Shadow Education Secretary, whether she would accept the recommendation of the pay review body, she sidestepped that very, very deliberately, and that's because no political party is willing to be completely bound and say, right, Preet's shaking her head, but it's...
Well, hang on. Well, so Preet, just answer the question. Would Labour now just accept the pay review body's recommendation and award 6.5% pay rise?
It's not as simple as that, is it?
Why not? Because everybody, all politicians, sorry about my frustration, literally say we always follow the pay review body's recommendations, and I always say, but actually you can overall. And they say, no, it's not customary to do that. We follow the pay review body. Now, I've come to the conclusion you only follow the pay review body recommendations on the government side, particularly in this case, when it's low.
But there's a lot of issues in terms of teachers. I mean, the fact that they're having to take this position is because the government has really failed to negotiate and actually do their job, which is what they should be doing. They should be foreseeing that this was going to happen. Pay is really important. Retention of teachers is important.
My question is,
the vacancy
what about 6.5%?
But Jo, is it just about the 6.5%? Because actually teachers are leaving the profession. They're not staying. So there's a bigger problem other than just pay. Right. And the government's got us into this situation. Labour shouldn't just accept that this is the inevitable position we find ourselves, because we wouldn't be in in this position. We'd be doing our job.
I know you always say you wouldn't be in this position, but you may well be. Would you accept a 6.5% pay rise? That would be a firm signal to teachers.
Right, what we would have to do is have access to all the information to understand what this means for retention, what it means for people staying in the profession, how we address the vacancies.
Yes.
I mean, we really are struggling. I mean, honestly, I say this as a parent as well, the disruption from the pandemic and now to see the teacher strikes. I know teachers don't want to take this decision,
I'm going to
and
come
it's
back to you,
impacting on their education.
All right, well, let's just get a sense of what it is actually like, because
responsibility.
Laura talked about the fact that it's more than pay, talked about defined state sector pensions. But what about the workload for teachers?
Well, it's a mixture of both, right? So I have friends and family who've been in the teaching profession, and they haven't essentially seen a raise in over a decade. You know, these are huge squeezes where some teachers are not able to afford basic goods and food. This is just a catastrophic time where 40,000 teachers left in 2022.
And was it about pay ostensibly, or was it about the workload?
It's a mixture of both. Why on earth would you join a profession where you're working obscene hours every week for obscenely low pay that can't...
What are the obscene hours?
Well, I mean, I have friends who are working every weekend. They're working, you know, they don't get a break. And we talk about, oh, yeah, but they've got, you know, half terms, they've got summer holidays. They work through those. You know, these are people that are probably per hour paid minuscule amounts.
Tom?
Well, I've just gone through this, but on sort of a hyper version of it. The school that my eldest boy goes to has been shut down for about 6 weeks for various strikes. It's been kind of an extraordinary situation. So I think this is just part of a wider story that's going to bubble away under the surface for a long time, and it will be with the Labour Party if they come in, because it's not just about pay, it's about class sizes, it's about workload and all that, and it's also about the bigger picture. It links back to inflation and the fact that we're having to make decisions about who is going to take the pain when we push down on the economy, and also we are a poorer country than we thought we were.
Right.
Since 2008. This is the problem.
Well, to pick on your point on inflation, I'll just show you this. Mary Bousted, head of the National Education Union. She says the answer is no to the question, does public sector pay drive inflation? What would you say?
I mean, of course it does. Of course, a part of it is to do with inflation. All pay has an impact on inflation.
But if it's mainly to do with external factors, which is probably what is being argued here, then why would it drive inflation?
It's all the factors, isn't it? This is the thing, and the government has to manage all of these, and it has to choose who's going to vote for it and who's going to take the pain.
But if the state of the schools is such, as the example that Tom has said, and the sort of workload that Jade is talking about, isn't it a must to meet that pay review body recommendation?
Well, what I was going to say, first of all, I agree, and Andrew Bailey has said the same thing, that you can't...
That's the Bank of England governor.
It is a fallacy to suggest that increasing wages, it does not have an effect on inflation. It's absolute fallacy. The other point, I think, which is one that you were pursuing with the other guests, is about conditions. And actually, when you settle any industrial action, often people think it's just about haggling over pay. It's never as simple as that. And actually, part of the government's offer is reducing the workload of teachers by 5 hours per week. Now, that, I think, is significant, because when teachers have written to me, definitely the extent of the workload is relevant too. So I agree with Tom. I think this is going to go on for some time. But some of these difficult disputes, for example, the nurses, have been settled without meeting their ask. But you know, they've recently balloted and they didn't pass the threshold.
Doesn't look like, but it doesn't look as if that's going to happen in this case, does it, Laura? And also, you've got all 4 unions, education unions, school unions, balloting for strike, including head teachers. This crisis is only going one way at the moment. And what is that going to do to a generation of school children? They're not necessarily thinking about inflation and the economy. What they're thinking about is our schools aren't going to be open.
No, well, but that's why the government's got the minimum service level legislation going through and close to hitting the statute book, which is in common with every other country in the G7, which guarantees some level of minimum services provided when a strike takes place in an essential public service. That's been upheld as compatible by the International Labour Organization, and that will mean that schools will have to continue offering some basic level of education and can't just close the doors because teachers are striking over pay.
Not something that you support, of course.
Well, look, I mean, we've got it. We're going back to the same situation. 40,000 teachers left the profession. That is serious. What does that say about our education?
Right.
And of course, these are public sector workers who haven't had a pay increase over the last 10 years. Actually, they're the ones that have had to pay.
So you do agree to a higher pay threshold?
We agree that they have got to negotiate. They've got to come to a settlement agreement. We shouldn't be in this situation. Our children should not suffer because the government couldn't do their job, and that is why we are in this position.
But if you're appealing to voters out there now, Preet, including teachers, imagine the signal it would send if you said now, if Labour agreed, we would meet that pay review body level of 6.5%. People would know exactly what Labour stood for when it came to this issue.
Absolutely. Look, people will know exactly what Labour stands for when we publish our manifesto and when we cost it, because, you know, we're not going to be making those decisions right now a year and a half ahead of a general election. And I think people understand that.
Right. Do you think that is fair enough now, or does Labour need to make a much firmer stand and offer now?
It would be helpful to have sort of meat to the bones, but I think that any response to this crisis more generally, where the perception is that, as I said, 20, 25, 30%, whatever the population is that's at that red button that's being squeezed, this is actually, Labour's not going to get scrutinised for this right now. At the moment, it's the government that's overseeing that. You know, these sort of younger workers, lower income workers are going to make up the bulk of the Tory base, and it looks like it's going to determine the next election. Both parties will need an answer to that, but right now I think the perception is that the Tory party has something to ask for.
Well, you said it's bubbling under or continuing this is going to go on into the autumn potentially, both on health strikes with this is with junior doctors and consultants. You're right, some of the health unions have obviously struck an agreement, and the same with teachers. How will that look as we approach the next election?
Not good. I mean, the Conservative Party obviously want to put all these issues to bed so that they can have a clear run at the general election, and that is obviously a sensible thing to do. But I think it's not just going to bubble on for 6 months. It's going to bubble on for years, because these are endemic questions within the public sector.
As a parent, what would you like the government to do in terms of these pay disputes?
I'd like the government to do everything, wouldn't I? I would like the government to keep the schools open, make them decent, get the kid in, and also so I can actually, use my GP service, and for my grandparents to be treated in hospitals that actually function. I
mean, this is the test that's going to be played. If you're still in the middle of strikes and still squabbling with key unions on things like education and health, it's going to be extremely difficult, isn't it, at the election?
Well, yeah, and all of that goes back to the rate of inflation. I mean, the reason why there's such an issue over pay is because of inflationary pressure, and I don't deny that is an absolutely critical component.
Right, and you agree with that, Preet. If inflation comes down, some of these issues can be resolved in part.
Well, I mean, we'll have to wait and see. Like I said, at the moment, people are really feeling and struggling, especially with, the weekly shop, mortgage rates going up. I don't see how we're going to get to that situation, especially when it's predicted we could end up being at 6% of interest rates at the end of this year. So, there doesn't seem to be much shift. After 12 times of Bank of England increasing interest rates, we're still here, the situation. And the government does need to step in, actually does need to do more. It doesn't see that the state has an offer, but actually people are expecting it to really be leading in this regard.
Before we move on, a reminder that you can catch up with Politics Live on the iPlayer, and you can now also find us on BBC Sounds. Every day we're publishing each programme as a podcast. Great, of course, if you're on the move. Let's talk about Birmingham and financial issues for the City Council. Preet Gill is a local MP and has written and talked about the situation. This is the headline in Birmingham Live. Blame, resignation calls and fear for vital services as Birmingham City Council faces financial chaos. We'll come to you in just a moment, Preet, about your ideas for a solution. But let's talk to Elizabeth Glinker, political editor for the BBC Midlands. Elizabeth, hello to you.
Hello,
How
Jo.
did Birmingham Council get itself into this mess?
Well, this is a long-running issue. It goes back many years. The first test cases on equal pay were more than a decade ago now. And in 2012, the council estimated that it would need to spend about £1.1 billion to cover all of those equal pay claims. It really relates to men and women not necessarily doing the same job historically at Birmingham City Council, but being on the same grade and yet being paid differently. So the typical example would be a bin man and a woman working as a carer or as a member of clerical staff in the back office. They're on the same grade, but the bin men were being paid a lot more, sometimes because they had access to overtime, sometimes because they were able to finish their shifts earlier because of the nature of their work and this sort of thing. So those are the workers that it relates to. What's happened now is that the council has found that it thinks that it is liable for up to £760 million more than it thought. That is a huge amount of money. In fact, it is on a par with the council's entire revenue budget for a year. So that is all the money that it spends on services in the city of Birmingham in a year. It's not entirely clear how this came about. The council says it's still working on that, but there are suggestions it could be linked to an IT system which the council has had difficulties with. It's been rolling out. That IT system is in itself overrunning to more than double the original estimate, approaching £100 million. Some suggestions it could be that. We're not entirely clear. It could also just be related to the way the council has been calculating these equal pay claims.
I mean, how is it going to, or how could it impact services in the region?
Well, yes, this is the thing. I think one thing to reinforce for those that don't know is that Birmingham City Council is a huge local authority, so quite different from London. London, of course, a much bigger city, but it's broken into many boroughs that do the work. Manchester, similarly. You think of Manchester, but even what people think of as Manchester is actually Trafford, Salford and Manchester. Birmingham local authority is the biggest in the United Kingdom, serving up to 1.3 million people, in fact the biggest in Europe. It is a huge local authority. Now, as I said, this amount of money that they have to find is equivalent to their entire revenue budget, and the options for councils are very, very limited. So we are looking at huge potential rises in council tax, maybe massive cuts to services. They could potentially go to the government and ask for some kind of loan. They could ask the government to be able to sell off some of their capital assets, so some of the property they own in the city. But it is very difficult to see how the council will progress here, and it is something that I know behind closed doors they're working very hard on.
Elizabeth Glinker, thank you, but stay with us for the rest of the discussion. Preet, should the government bail out Birmingham Council?
Well, look, this is a really difficult situation. They've already paid out £1.1 billion, and as we know, the revenue budget is £750 million at the moment.
Should the government bail them out?
Well, look, the government has stripped the City Council of £1 billion. It's already made efficiency services. It's halved its workforce. I don't see how it can continue to make more efficiencies, or what is it going to stop delivering. So the government does need to step in. It needs to look at the £1 billion it's taken away from this council, how it can absolutely support it at this point in time, because nobody wants to see any, going back on delivery of services.
It's a huge council, the biggest in the UK. It can't be allowed to fail financially in that sense. Surely the government has to bail it out, Laura.
Well, let me just say that this does show the inadequacies of the checks and balances and the absolute Labour mismanagement of that council. Those equal pay cases aren't 10 years old. They're 20 years old. They've applied to councils all across the country. I worked on some of them, Hull, Leeds. They've all done those big structural equal pay cases.
The Conservative leader decided to backdate it. That's why Birmingham actually was the only council in the country to end up in that situation.
But it also made a mad decision to go to the Supreme Court when 90% of those cases had already been settled in favour of the women who were earning less.
So you think it's incompetence?
Well, I think it's gross incompetence.
Well,
and so although I don't, I'm not an MP for Birmingham. I don't know the nuts and bolts. I really think it goes to the checks and balances that were badly missing when councils across the country were facing similar massive bills and making sensible decisions.
They didn't have £1 billion taken by central government, and it's not right to increase
pragmatic
council
decisions
tax.
to reach settlement with people who were quite obviously making very good claims for work rated as equal, which should have been completely obvious from the structure of the.
But we are here where should the government bail them out, or are you going to let those services be cut?
Well, I'm very loath to see failing councils immediately bailed out when they've made decisions which really...
They need sustainable funding. I mean, you're not giving them... This is the largest local authority in Europe. You've taken £1 billion from it. How do you expect it to deliver its services? Of course it needs government support because it relies on its money from government. It isn't just about council tax increases. That's always been your solution, is increased council tax.
I really
put the money down to constituents.
I really think that the council needs to take responsibility for a succession of some of the poorest decisions, actually, in handling that litigation. As I say, there isn't another council in the country, all of whom, or a vast majority, particularly in the north, have had the same problem.
Well,
who've made
not the
those
same
decisions.
problem, but other councils, as you know, have either gone bust or effectively have gone bust, and they include Conservative councils. Woking, Croydon, Thurrock, Slough have all been issued with these notices. So they may be different reasons, but this is not a Labour issue.
But the equal pay burden... The equal pay burden, which is the cause of Birmingham's problems, has affected other councils. It affected particularly in the north, and it particularly was what were traditional male roles and traditional female roles, where there was a pay disparity that was unlawful. And it is extraordinary the way they chose to fight that all the way and pour money down the drain.
Right, why should taxpayers be forced to bail out what Laura thinks is incompetence over the particular issue of equal pay claims?
Well, this is obviously a very specific case,
yes,
but it does sit within the context of, you know, who's actually going to be blamed here in terms of voters, who actually blame whom.
Yeah.
Because this is, you know, as has been alluded to, we're looking at a significant amount of time where councils have had their services cut. People have already seen their services cut. So this is just a sort of elongation of that context. So it'll be interesting to see if they blame the national government or the local government. And my feeling is that it will probably just lead to a complete discontent about British politics overall, which is unhealthy for everyone. But you cannot disregard the context of which is, you know, significant cuts overall.
Moving away from the specific, I mean, funding to local government has been cut, and reform has been something that they have been asked to do. But in essence, they're being asked to do more with less. Is that sustainable?
It depends on the number. At some point it's sustainable, and at some point it becomes unsustainable, and I guess that's where the checks and balances come in. But this is clearly not it's not being caused by austerity, is it? This is being caused by something else. It's now exacerbated by the fact that the council is desperately poor and out of money, and people are too poor to take further cuts to their services. So they do combine. But I mean, it is gross mismanagement, isn't it?
Well, do you accept that?
Well, no, I don't accept that. I think currently what we are asking, and we are holding the council to account, to say how on earth did you not know that the cost was going to be the amount that it is, and why are you not talking to government
ministers? And what
ministers
answers have you had?
Around. So what the leader tells me is that he's now set up a committee where they've brought in the external auditors. They are looking at this, and of course they've had to put a recruitment freeze on immediately. But of course,
but is that satisfactory? Are you satisfied with that answer?
Well, look, you know, I don't buy that. You know, when you've had austerity and you've had huge amounts of cuts, I mean, and you've tapped into your reserves already, because actually that's what, you know, you should be doing.
But do you accept they've made a mistake here?
I think they have to accept that there is some current mistake in terms of not knowing the actual number, because of course you've got to be able to manage your budgets and forecast what's coming out of it.
It's a huge number.
It is a huge number, but it also you can't come away from what you said, Jo, is the funding settlement for councils has been absolutely astronomical, because they've faced huge amounts of cuts, asking to do more for less, and that is the reality of it. And so the government must step in. The government has got to absolutely support the citizens and the council, because it is partly the problem in terms of taking that money out.
Laura?
Well, I mean, asking the government to bail out Birmingham City Council, which is unique in completely mishandling very serious unlawful discrimination, which is what an equal pay claim is, I have to say, an unattractive proposition. Look, I do accept the effect of a Section 114 notice means that you are stripped down to basic services, and I'm sure there's going to be a dialogue between central government and local government about that.
No one's having those conversations.
But the idea that something as serious as this automatically involves the government getting the chequebook out is something I feel inherently very uncomfortable.
Birmingham City Council is too big anyway. If it's the biggest council in Europe, it's not a very successful council, and it's clearly too big to fail. No government can just allow public services for, 1 million people to just be cut to the bone. You can't do that. So the government may have to step in. Then it's going to have to get a tighter grip on Birmingham so this doesn't happen again.
Well, let's just go to Elizabeth. I think we've got time. Listening to the discussion, Preet says there aren't those sorts of debates going on at the moment in terms of Birmingham sort of reducing its services to sort of basic level. Is that the case?
I think behind the scenes they're very much in sort of crisis management mode at the moment, trying to figure out what this does mean. I do know that they have been in communication with the Department for Levelling Up, and there is a hope that there will be discussions and that some government assistance may be available. I think actually the point is this is a huge council. We are talking about a lot of people. Is it too big to fail? because we are talking about services delivered to some of the poorest people in the country in some wards here, and also the linchpin for the entire West Midlands region in terms of finance and culture.
All right, well, I think that's all we've got time for. Elizabeth Glinker there in the Midlands, the BBC's political editor there. That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us today. I'll be back tomorrow for Prime Minister's Questions at the normal time for Politics Live at 11:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. So please join us then. From all of us here, bye-bye.